Hello, welcome everyone to Forensic Linguistics Month today. My name is Sardar Servet. I am responsible for the moderation of this meeting today. Our guest is Tammy Gales today. Welcome, Tammy Gales, the word is yours.
Thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you excellently.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me. This is a really exciting opportunity to share what we do in forensic linguistics with your linguistics society. So I appreciate the invitation. Today I'm going to talk about our forensic linguistics capital case innocence project. I'll go ahead and share screen. Okay, you can see that okay?
Excellent. That's good.
Okay, great. Okay, my name is Tammy Gales. I am an associate professor of linguistics at Hofstra University in New York. I'm also the director of research at the Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Threat Assessment, and Strategic Analysis. We really apparently like long names for things. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that is part of our Forensic Linguistics Institute, and that is the Capital Case Innocence Project. So as linguists, as you know, every time we speak, every time we write, every time we sit down at a keyboard, every time we send a text, we encode clues as to who we are as people. It can indicate or give clues to where we might be from, where you're living or where you've lived in the past, what generation you're from, what kind of work you do, what languages you speak, and even what movies you've watched. There's a really famous case, the JonBenet Ramsey case, where it was the ransom note. It was indicated that they had just watched two recent Westerns, and he was creating his ransom note based on direct discourse from those movies. So case after case, forensic linguists have been able to glean a large amount of information or intelligence from seemingly minor details that are often overlooked. And just to remind ourselves about linguistic variation, we have variation, systematic variation at all levels. So excuse me, in the States, for example, these three words, Mary, 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 depending on where you're from, can be pronounced exactly the same way, which is my language variety. I'm from Minnesota. They can be pronounced in two different ways, or they can be pronounced in three different ways, which is what most New Yorkers do. We have other kinds of variation. So I know for standard speakers, prescriptivists, they would not appreciate, let me ask you a question. But as I remind speakers all the time who revere Shakespeare and Chaucer, that this was actually the form that they used. We have switched it to ask instead of ax. He is recommended with an apostrophe ed. We had a case one year where the prosecutors said, oh, look at this really strange ending to this word, aha, and the suspected writer used it too. But what we were able to find out is that really unique morphological ending was actually very systematic in the particular community of practice that we were looking at. We have syntactic variation, like I might could go this weekend, the double modal construction, which many people don't like, but it's very prevalent in the South. I'll have a Coke, so lexical variation. In the South, in a lot of places, they also say, I'll have a Coke. That doesn't sound too weird to us until we find out that you go to a restaurant, the server says, what would you like to drink? Oh, I'll have a Coke. What kind of Coke? I'll have a Dr. Pepper. So they're using Coke as the generic term for soda or pop. And then we have another layer of variation at the pragmatic level, where you have to know the context, the situation, the speech event, and the relationship between the speakers in order to interpret, is that a genuine request for information and showing concern, or could that potentially be a threat? And this was one of Roger Shy, the founder of forensic linguistics in the US, one of his very famous cases. And these are the building blocks of language, as we know. So as we just saw, phonetics, the study of speech sounds; phonology, looking at the sounds plus the rules; morphology, looking at structure and word formation; syntax, how they all flow together in clauses and sentences; semantics, looking at meanings and morphemes, words, phrases, etc. And pragmatics, looking at meaning in its wider context. So as forensic linguists, we take basically all the linguistic tools, because we are linguists who just apply our skills to forensic and legal contexts. So we take all of these building blocks, looking at systematic variation at all levels, and we apply them to a range of typical assignments in forensic linguistics. Some of the ones that are most common that we get in at our institute, for example, are looking at linguistic features pointing to an author's demographic background. This would be considered linguistic demographic profiling. Comparing linguistic patterns in questioned and known writings. So this is what we consider to be authorship analysis. And then looking at ambiguous phrases or discourse strategies, underlying meaning, larger pragmatic meaning, and this we would call forensic discourse analysis. So what we're going to focus on today, I'm going to walk you through a case, an authorship case that we got in through the Institute several years ago. And this was about a disputed confession statement. So thanks to the true crime genre, more and more people are becoming familiar with the notion of false confessions. They're not as obscure as they once used to be. But with true crime genre, and especially thanks to Netflix, we have shows like Making a Murderer. I'm not sure if, I did look up the top 20 streaming shows over the past 20 years from Turkey on Netflix. And while not all of these are listed there, you definitely had a lot of true crime genre shows. But Making a Murderer is one of the first ones that Netflix produced, and it was one of their most successful, walking people through the Stephen Avery case of a false confession, which then later turned into, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend going back and watching it. It turned into another issue of a false confession with somebody else. When They See Us, this is a docudrama about the Central Park Five, which has gotten a lot of press recently. They were accused of violently beating and raping a woman in Central Park, and turned out later that while they were in the park and they were committing mischief, they had nothing to do with this violent attack. And then there's another series called The Confession Tapes. And The Confession Tapes, it's an interesting series. It takes, I think it has 11 episodes right now, and it documents 11 different cases where false confessions were highlighted. Talks about why they arose, the conditions under which they're frequently involved in cases, and what the system is trying to do to prevent false confessions. Despite all of our awareness, false confessions are still a huge problem. The Innocence Project has said that approximately, what they're estimating as a low number, approximately 2.3 to 5% of all US prisoners are innocent. And they're saying, again, this is probably an under, a number that's under the actual number. If just 1% of prisoners are innocent, that means at least 20,000 innocent people are in jail. Innocence Project has also done studies that show that 29% of situations where there has been a false attribution or wrongfully accused person, false or incriminating statements have been made in 29% of those cases. And this one, while this study is a little bit older, there have been follow-up studies done that still show that this is fairly fairly similar to the 2020s. So because jurors still, even though we're much more aware of false confessions and their prevalence, jurors still think that if you confess to something that's such a heinous crime, you obviously committed the crime. So even when people give a false confession and later say, I didn't actually confess, or I was coerced to confess, juries will still convict 73 to 81% of the time, because it's still assumed that false confessions are counterintuitive. So this is when the Innocence Project was started, was to tackle these kinds of issues. And they started long before Netflix was popularizing the issue. So the Innocence Project started at a law school in 1992 to try to prevent wrongful convictions and overturn those kinds of convictions that contained faulty evidence. They primarily started by testing DNA evidence, because around this time, we finally could start testing DNA evidence when we couldn't do so before. Since this time, 375 people have been exonerated, and that's just by DNA evidence alone. Since this time, other innocence projects have arisen that have focused on things like hair and fiber analysis, ballistics, arson, and are also working with experts in those fields to address false confessions and wrongful convictions in those areas. 21 of these 375 who were exonerated by DNA were at one time sentenced to death. And this is oftentimes left out of the equation, but from this, because the cases have been reopened, 165 actual criminals have been identified and charged and convicted in the place of those who were wrongfully convicted. So as I mentioned, places around the country have, and actually around the world, there's a global innocence network now. You can look up, I think there's a link from the main Innocence Project page, but it's an international Innocence Project network, and you can look up in your country where the various locations are and where the projects are being housed. Some are in law firms, some are at universities. But as I mentioned, about 12 years ago, we started the Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Threat Assessment and Strategic Analysis. And we accept a variety of kinds of cases. So ones that look at criminal investigations, such as cold case murders, looking at questioned authorship of threatening communications, whether or not somebody understood their Miranda rights. And then we also do take civil cases, civil disputes too, such as trademark disputes, looking at contract interpretations and libel and slander cases as well. And under the Institute, about 7 or 8 years ago, in conjunction with our law school at Hofstra, my colleague Robert Leonard and our colleague in the law school, Eric Friedman, founded the Hofstra Forensic Linguistics Capital Case Innocence Project. Again, my colleague loves long titles for things. And for the Innocence Project, it's really unique. We have our students, our graduate and qualified undergraduate students, working with us as interns to work on live cases where language is the primary source of evidence. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through one of the cases that we did prior to the founding of the Innocence Project, but essentially came through the Innocence Project. And then I'll briefly touch on one that we just recently concluded. So the case, oops, that didn't, there we go. The case I'm going to talk about is that of Antoine Cuma. So this was a case, this happened in 1996, just outside of Chicago. Antoine Cuma, who was 18 at the time, and a friend of his, Kevin Jackson, who was 21, they're charged with murder and armed robbery. They had lured somebody into a back alley in the guise of selling auto parts. The guy brought cash. They ended up, someone ended up shooting the assailant, or the seller, whose name was Bruder. And supposedly, when the police came, they arrested Cuma, they arrested Jackson. Bruder was put into an ambulance, And supposedly on the way to the hospital, he identified QB as the one who had shot him. The problem is he underwent emergency surgery almost immediately. And the medical examiner had said, given the damage that had been done to him, there's no way he could have said anything, let alone identified QB as his shooter. So there was a question around all of this to begin with. QB was taken to the police station and interrogated for a very lengthy time. It was something like 21 hours. Eventually, the police said he gave a confession. QB, at the end of everything, was sentenced to life in prison, even though he says he did not give the confession statement. He was sentenced to life in prison, and Jackson was sentenced to 40 years. Now, this is important to come back around to the end. And Jackson was sentenced to 40 years because supposedly he only looked on while QB did the actual shooting. So when this case was brought to us, we were given this statement. Don't try to read it, it's very small, but we were given this statement. This is a copy, the first page of a 2-page typed document that is supposedly QB's confession statement. So we were asked to analyze the language patterns of the 2-page typed document. And you'll see just barely at the bottom, that's QB's signature, and that is QB's signature. He said, yes, that is my signature. And I'll tell you why it's on that page in just a minute. I didn't realize I could hide that, sorry. And so this was the evidence that was entered in as the verbatim voluntary confession of QB to the shooting of Jeremy Bruder. And remember, confessions have to be voluntary. And so that's why this was entered in as his verbatim language and being voluntary. And QB says, no, neither one of those is correct. So QB, as I just mentioned, he completely denied having dictated or had any part of authoring this confession. He said he was taken to a cell, beaten, interrogated, and if he wanted to make a phone call to call his lawyer, he was told to sign these blank forms before he was able to be allowed to make the phone call. In the meantime, he was kept out of the room for approximately an hour and a half, and when he came back in, the next thing he saw is those 2 forms that he had signed had the typed confession over his signature. So the authorship of this confession statement is in question. So in the case, we compared 2 competing hypotheses. So hypothesis 1 was the language patterns of the confession statement, the Q document, are better explained as being similar to those of QB, or consistent with the language patterns of QB. Or hypothesis 2, that what we're seeing in terms of the language patterns of the confession statement, the question document, are better explained as potentially being influenced or written by someone else other than QB. So the corpora we examined, and we always want to look, even if it's a small corpus, we want to look at some kind of comparison data. So the question document obviously was the first document that we looked at. Second corpus that we created were 14 letters that QB had written while he was in prison. These were a mix of formal and informal registers. So some of the language was requests for parole. They were requests for his lawyer. Those were much more formal in tone. And then there were also some personal letters as well. And those were quite informal in tone. And because QB said that he didn't write the document and that somebody else had written the document, the questioned confession statement, it would have been the police who would have had a hand in that. So we asked for Detective Jorgensen, who is the lead detective on this case at the time, for any kind of writing that we could get from him. The only thing that we could get from him as a comparison sample was his testimony. So already you'll see that there's kind of a mismatch here in terms of register. We always want to try to keep spoken and written and formal and informal things as close as possible. So we do have a mix of that here. Now that will actually come into play in the analysis in an interesting way. So as a spoiler alert, judges always like to see your conclusion right on the front page. So we looked at a variety of different features. I'm just going to cover these 5 briefly here today. So complementizer deletion, we looked at contraction patterns, discourse markers, lexical choice, and syntactic structure. And we should note that when we're doing authorship analyses, we would never focus on just one thing alone to make any kind of conclusions. And we never will say that based on these language patterns, that QB wrote the question document or that Detective Jorgensen wrote the question document. What we're doing is we're showing consistency or inconsistency with certain groupings of features that we're finding. So I'm going to cover these 5 today. And here's your spoiler alert. The general findings in the question document do not also appear in QB's known writings. So it supports hypothesis 2 that the document was written probably by somebody other than QB. All right, so let's take a look at these. All right, so that complementizer deletion, it's not consistent between the confession statement and QB's documents. We're going to look at those first. So that complementizer deletion, it's a stylistic feature. It's not an ungrammatical feature. So when we're talking about complementizer deletion, you can say, I know that he is here, or I know he is here. You can include the that, or you can take the that out. Both are completely grammatical according to a standard variety, and it's really a stylistic preference. Now that every time we do a case like this, I start paying attention to these features in my own writing, and I've actually found some interesting patterns when it comes to, I find that I use that in my academic writing a lot, whereas in my informal writing, I tend to take it out. So you might even have preferences in terms of register use of whether you include it or don't. So in the question document, the confession statement, out of all the times that it could occur, 8% were deleted. So that means that the that was there, the complementizer that was there in a majority of the instances. In QB's writing, however, 86% were deleted. So he preferred, his style was to delete the complementizer that. So here we have a disparity in terms of whether that was included or that was deleted. Same thing when we look at contraction patterns. And contraction patterns, they're one of those things that could go under the radar, and unless you're really focused on and aware of them and how they're being used, this is not necessarily a pattern that an average speaker or writer would pick up. These were also not consistent between the question document and QB's writings. So again, this is based on personal style. Sometimes in formal writing, most oftentimes in formal writing, we say don't use contractions. That's shifting a lot, I've noticed with my students, as they're starting to embed more contractions in their academic writing. But sometimes it's just a matter of personal style. And in certain cases, not this one, but in another case, the one that I mentioned earlier with the interesting morphological apostrophe ED for the recommended, we found that the use of contractions, the writer tended to contract negatives, like I haven't, have not, but did not contract positives, like I am instead of I'm. So even down to those level of nuances, we can find interesting patterns. So in this case, the question document contracted 17% of the times. So again, they used mostly uncontracted language. QB's case, 86% contracted. So we're seeing a very similar pattern to what we saw with the that complementizer deletion. QB preferred contracting, both positives and negatives, whereas the question document preferred to not contract as often. Discourse markers, this one was a very interesting one. Again, not consistent between QB's language and the confessions, or the confession statement. So we looked at a variety of different discourse markers, things like well, now, so. They're used through QB's writing. Not a single instance of these 3 discourse markers is found in the question document. So just as an example, I'm just using well. Now, the question document doesn't have any instances of well. QB's writing frequently starts sentences with well. And if you were all in person right now, I would ask you a question. Did somebody just raise their hand? I'm happy to have you participate if you'd like to chime in.
I thought it was by an accident.
Oh, okay, no problem. Okay, so yes, if we were in person right now, I would ask you all a question, and I would say, what's interesting about that? If we think about, again, remember the confession statement is supposed to be a verbatim document of QB's spoken language, whereas the corpus from QB is all written language. We would expect there to be more discourse markers if this indeed is QB's language in the confession statement, because it's spoken. Discourse markers occur much more frequently from corpus studies in spoken language than in written language, yet we don't get any. So we thought this was an interesting finding, especially since in QB's written language, he uses discourse markers as if he were speaking, especially in his informal writing, but he did it also in his formal writing. So this led us to start thinking about police speak, and this has been an interesting phenomenon that different people have started looking into, started creating corpora of actual police language. Police are not taught to use particular language, but they are indoctrinated into the way to write police reports. Oftentimes they will get samples as they're going through their trainings. They will be asked to copy other officer samples when they first start on the force. So they do get indoctrinated into particular orders, into particular kinds of language. And so there's some certain features that we have found that are quite indicative of police speak. So because we had Detective Jorgensen, who was actually part of the case, we looked at his lengthy transcript, just as a comparison corpus. So these are just some examples of lexical choice. There were a lot of time markers, like approximately at an unknown time, that occurred multiple times in the question document and in the officer's language, but never in QB's written documents, even though he used other markers to talk about time. There were other things that were quite pervasive in the question document and the officer's language, like the different discussions of weapons, different ways that they described vehicles, different ways that they described addresses or intersections, how they described witnesses, what they looked like, what they were wearing, specific locations where things happened, monetary units, all of those. While there were multiple ways, multiple words used to describe these, they were very consistent across the confession statement and the officer's language. And QB, in all of these cases, had talked about certain of these items, but used very different descriptors or very different syntactic patterns to mark those lexical choices. And then this is probably the most well-known structure in police speak, and it's been documented in a number of different cases now. So it's the placement of the simple word then, the time marker. So the canonical structure is then plus the subject and then the verb. So we ate breakfast, then we went home, would be what you would find in your average speaker's language or writer's language. The non-canonical structure that we see oftentimes in police language is switched. So we ate breakfast, we then went home. And we've hypothesized reasons why this might happen. Again, police are not trained to do this, but you will pervasively see this in police language. And that, we hypothesize, is because they are trained to identify the subject who is doing something and then set up the chronology. So they're identifying the person or the pronoun and then giving us the chronological sequence of action, as opposed to the chronology, then the person or the subject who's doing something. This needs more study. This is a hypothesis, but it seems to play out in a lot of different police language situations. So again, the Q had subject plus then. The officer, even in his spoken language, used subject plus then. QB never used that syntactic pattern. He always used them plus subject. And this happened numerous times throughout the different corpora. And these are just some examples. And one other case that I like to point out where this was first identified is our colleague from the UK, who is now living in Brazil, Malcolm Coulthart. He worked on the case of Derek Bentley, and this was an awful case. He supposedly instigated a shooting in 1953 of a policeman, and he had encouraged his young companion, his young friend, to shoot the policeman by saying, "Let him have it." Now, it's questionable whether "let him have it" means shoot him, like let him have it in terms of shoot him, kill him, or give him the gun, because the officer was asking for them to give up the gun. Bentley signed a confession statement. He later claimed that the police helped him produce it. It wasn't his actual language. In 1993, and then he was actually hanged for this crime. In 1993, the case was reopened by his family to try to pardon him after he had been put to death. Finally, in 1998, Malcolm Coulthart had been working on this case, and the court overturned the conviction and found Bentley to be innocent. So it took a long time for this to happen, but one of the key markers was the syntactic variation of the use of then. So what Malcolm did in this case is he looked at the question document. He looked at the writings of the writings of 3 police officers. You'll see on the question document on the left, the writings of the 3 police officers on the right. And then he compared that to non-police language. He looked at the Bank of English, which is a large corpus of spoken British language, and the statements of 3 witnesses. And as you can see, that syntactic placement of then matches with the police language again. So when we bring this all back to the QB case, the linguistic analysis reveals an absence of a number of links between the question document, the confession statement, and QB's writing, and a presence of a number of links between the Q and the officer's language. This strongly supports hypothesis 2, as the language patterns of the question document being better described as somebody other than QB's language. So this supports QB's contention that he was not the author. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning to bring this back together. We submitted our report and it was accepted. And at that point, QB had just run out of appeals. So this was filed finally in 2015. In 2016, we have a torture inquiry and relief commission that was investigating terrible happenings, terrible beatings that were happening within the Chicago police departments. And it just so happens that the person who interrogated QB was in charge of the unit at that time. And they even have pictures in his case file, which had been hidden. There are pictures in his case file when he was brought in. He had no markings, no beatings. When after his interrogation, when he was booked, he was full of beatings. So there's a lot of evidence that he was, that QB's story was true. Sadly, that was still going through the process. In 2018, do you remember the co-defendant who was 21 years old and QB was 18? The co-defendant, who had been given a 40-year sentence, he was paroled at 20 years. He confessed that he actually was the one who shot the victim and not QB. And the evidence, now that we can go back and do more DNA testing, the evidence corroborates this. There was a lack of gunpowder residue on QB, and the DNA matched his co-defendant, Jackson. The reason this happened is Chicago, Illinois, was a death penalty state. QB was just turning 18. He was tried as an adult, but he had a clean record, and they knew he wouldn't get the death penalty. Whereas Jackson was 21, he would definitely be tried as an adult, and he had a criminal record prior to that. He most likely would have gotten the death penalty. And because he can't be tried for the same crime twice, his confession now doesn't really do anything for him. He could get obstruction of justice or some other charge, but he can't be charged for that murder again. Unfortunately, and it's crazy, our justice system is so slow. It's 2023 and QB's still in prison. So he's still waiting for this to get wrapped up. And just the pictures, this is a picture of the prison where QB actually is. And this is the back of a t-shirt that some of his supporters created for him. It's injustice, freedom, exoneration, and innocent. So I wanted to end just by summarizing a more recent case where we had more immediate success and applicability, even though our report in the previous one definitely went to help QB. This one was amazingly fast. So I'm not sure if you heard about the recent Innocence Project case, the Melissa Lucio case. She was the first woman in the state of Texas who was on death row, and she was sentenced to be put to death on April 27th, just this past year. So she had been charged in 2007 with murdering her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah. And I won't go into the whole backstory behind it. There's a lot of evidence that the daughter had fallen down the stairs by accident 2 days prior, while she was supposedly under her father's care. And she was never taken to the hospital, and she eventually died from the damage that she got when she fell down the stairs. But Lucia was charged with the murder. She was questioned for a little over 5 hours. Her husband, Alvarez, was questioned for just under 3 hours. And the officer said while Lucia was being questioned that she had confessed, and she was eventually sentenced for the murder. And as I said, scheduled to be put to death on April 27th, just this past year. I should note, she was also pregnant, very pregnant at the time she was questioned, with another child, and it was also the middle of the night, and she had just found out that she had lost Mariah. So she was in no state to be questioned for this long. So Lucio's lawyers had claimed that she had been unfairly treated by the police, that her confession had been coerced. They hadn't given her a break. They hadn't given her water, a bathroom break. They hadn't given her food. They also said they said gender bias in the questioning between the husband and Melissa. So they were asking our Innocence Project to take a look at the 2 interrogations. So this would fall more under the instance of a forensic discourse analysis. And, oops. Sorry. The research question we asked is, what features were present in the questioning of Lucio, and were they different than those present in the questioning of Alvarez? So the 2 hypotheses we looked at were that the features of Lucio's were more similar to an information gathering interview, or the features in Lucio's were more similar to an accusatory interrogation. And we followed the 5 dimensions of institutional talk. So we looked at things like lexical choice, turn design, the sequence of organization, the overall structural organization of the interrogations or interviews, and the social roles that were assigned to them by the questioning officer's language. So I won't go through the analysis here. But I will just say that we very quickly put together a report. We only had about less than 2 weeks to analyze hundreds of pages. But we submitted the report just a couple days before her execution was scheduled for. And the governor of Texas looked at the report, looked at the argument made by the lawyers, and just 2 days before her execution date, she was granted a stay. So she is now in the next steps awaiting the process of what comes next. So basically, they're trying to decide whether she should get a new trial, whether her prior conviction will stand, but she will just no longer face the death penalty. So she's in that process right now. But that one, it can show how slowly the justice system works and how very, very quickly it can work at the same time. So there are some success stories that we get to see also. So I will end there. I always, because this is such a heavy topic, I always like to put just a little joy, smiling dog faces. These are my puppies who have been very quiet and behaving well upstairs. That is my email. I also have the Forensic Linguistics Capital Case Innocence Project email on here. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow-ups, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Let me...
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. We really enjoyed this. I think all of us enjoyed this. I personally enjoyed it. So I think questions will come from both text forms and spoken form. So I can read you all the questions if you want, or you can choose to read them on your own.
I will let you read them because I'm not seeing them.
Okay.
Again, I'm really, really good with Zoom because that's the platform I've been on for the last couple of years. This one's brand new for me, so it's good for me to learn a new one. Oh, I think I see there's the chat. Okay.
Okay. So, are you reading the questions? Or?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So, which one of the hypotheses is more relatable? Is your question about the formatting of the hypothesis between the two different cases? Just in general. Well, I guess I approach the casework that we do, and I've worked with my colleague Rob Leonard to get him in this process too. These are research projects. Every single case that we do, we take from the perspective of a research project. So all good research projects have to have a research question. And depending on the research question, your hypotheses are going to be different based on what kind of question you're asking. So I would say there's not just one kind of hypothesis that is most comfortable for me. I keep asking him to put in a null hypothesis too, right? Where the null would be we can't make a differentiation, or we can't draw a conclusion. So that started being part of the cases as well. Lawyers never like to see that. They always want us to take that out. But as social scientists, that's something that we need to consider and report as well. So the form of hypothesis is going to shift based on the research question you're asking. Which of the cases affected me the most? Wow, they all affect me. They're all so heavy and so tragic, especially in cases where there's injustice being done. And that's not our place to say whether that is or is not the end result. We are just contributing to an analysis to lend support to a research question about the language discourse. But of course, we do get personally invested in the stories as well. I try my hardest to stay out of the stories while I'm working on a case and try to know as little as possible about the stories, because I think it keeps us more on an even footing to know as little as possible. So, for example, when presented with the Lucio data, while the research question was formatted in a way that was, general, is Lucio's more information gathering or more accusatory, and we could follow a social science framework to work through that. I didn't want to know all the background about what had happened, the relationship between Lucio and Alvarez. I didn't want to know all that, just because I didn't want it to affect me so personally while I was doing the analysis. But they all affect me. That's definitely part of the work. When I think of forensic linguistics, I think of detectives and dark cases. Is forensic linguistics really like that, or does it have a funny side? Of course, I'm not going to be able to think of anything off the top of my head, but there are definitely some cases that we get that are a bit out there. We sometimes get cases from private individuals saying that they have been contacted by Martians and they have communications with them and they would like to know if they're authentic, and can we do some kind of comparison with some kind of Martian corpus. So we do get some, I will just say, odd requests sometimes. Those are usually ones we don't always take because we try to only work through lawyers, just because that's where you're going to be able to make a difference in the justice system. But we do get some odd cases that help lighten things up a little bit. Yeah, I will say that true crime television has definitely for the most part, done a good job. We do have to be careful with some of the true crime shows because they still are Hollywood. They still are, they call them docudramas because they're not full documentaries. And like in the one that I mentioned about the Central Park Five, when they see us, the prosecutor, she basically, the way that she was portrayed, she's gotten death threats. And she said, it wasn't like that. She said, yes, we were, given the climate at the time and the cleanup the city initiatives, she said, we were pushed very hard. But she said, the way that she was portrayed was very unfair. And the same thing for, this one didn't have language evidence, but there was a recent one about Jeffrey Dahmer and the police officers who basically had the chance to arrest him and they let him go, and that they were given an award in the city later. That didn't happen. That never happened. So it can mislead us to a sense, and it can put people in a bad light that shouldn't necessarily be in a bad light. But it has raised a lot of awareness about false confessions. And in that sense, that's good. Just if you do like true crime, just always make sure to question, the terrible things that they're saying and how terrible they really may or may not be. And sometimes they are. Sometimes they are just that bad. But we have to be cautious about being overly critical of law enforcement and prosecution, because a lot of them are really good too. But yeah, it's definitely raised awareness.
Okay.
Thank you all for your kind comments.